They said I'd violated a landscaping rule, something about the color of my mulch. But that small notice in my mailbox? It was the first domino in a war I never wanted. Let me start from beginning. When I bought my house, I thought I'd finally made it. It was a small place, tucked into a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of area where every driveway looked freshly power washed, every lawn trimmed to perfection. The Homeowners Association, or HOA, was supposed to keep everything looking uniform, safe, and community-friendly. That's what they called it in the brochure. Back then, I didn't think twice about the monthly dues. A couple $100 for neighborhood maintenance and peace of mind didn't sound unreasonable. I worked long hours as a systems analyst, so the idea of someone else making sure the lawns stayed neat and the sidewalks stayed repaired seemed like a fair trade, but peace doesn't last long in neighborhoods like this. The first sign that something was off came 6 months after I moved in. I opened my mailbox one Friday evening after work and found a white envelope with the HOA logo on the top. Inside was a single-page letter printed on thick paper, with bold black text that seemed almost angry in tone. It said I was in violation of community standards for using brown mulch instead of approved redwood tone. At first, I laughed. It had to be a mistake. My front yard was small, maybe 15 feet wide, and the mulch was something I'd picked up at Home Depot. Nothing fancy, nothing wild, but the letter gave me 10 days to correct the issue or face a fine of $250 per week. That weekend, I took pictures of the yard, sent an email to the HOA board, and politely explained that there must have been some kind of mix-up. The next day, I got a short reply, a single sentence telling me the violation stands. That was the moment I realized this HOA wasn't what it claimed to be. Over the next few weeks, more letters started showing up. One said my trash cans were visible from the street for too long. Another complained that my grass height exceeded the acceptable range. I measured it myself. It was under 2 inches. Each violation came with a fine. I'd never missed a mortgage payment in my life, but now, with the HOA adding charges every few days, I felt like I was being bled dry by people who lived 2 blocks away and barely knew my name. Decided to attend the next HOA meeting just to understand what was happening. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a small building at the edge of the neighborhood. I remember walking in and feeling every eye turn toward me. At the head of the table sat the board, 5 people, all older than me by at least a decade. The president, a woman named Margaret, ran the meeting with the kind of authority that made everyone else shrink into silence. The way they talked about homeowners wasn't friendly or professional. It was like they saw us as tenants in their personal fiefdom. Every complaint was brushed off unless it involved something cosmetic, paint colors, mailbox height, or lawn ornaments. When it was my turn to speak, I brought up the letters, the fines, and the lack of any actual rule violations. I'd even brought copies of the HOA's own guidelines, which didn't mention mulch color anywhere.
Margaret didn't like that. ... She smiled that tight. Practiced kind of smile people use when they're annoyed, but want to look polite. Then she said something about community cohesion and respecting the intent of the design standards. The rest of the board nodded like a row of bobbleheads.
When I got home that night, another letter was already waiting for me, a warning for disruptive conduct at the HOA meeting. That's when it stopped feeling like incompetence. It started to feel like a setup. The following month, I decided to look into the HOA's finances. I'd never thought about it before, but I realized I had no idea where our monthly dues actually went. So I requested access to the association's financial records, which by law they were required to share with homeowners. That's when things got weird. My request was ignored for 2 weeks. Then I got a response saying the documents were being audited and unavailable for review. A week later, I received a certified letter saying I was being fined for failure to maintain community harmony. That wasn't even a rule. They just made it up. At that point, I knew this was more than just a few overzealous rule enforcers. Something was deeply wrong with the way the HOA was operating. I started talking to my neighbors, casually at first. A lot of them were hesitant, afraid even. But once they realized I wasn't one of them, they started opening up. Turns out, several had been fined for absurd things too. One woman for having a flower pot in her front yard, another for parking her car too close to the curb. But none of them had ever fought back. They just paid the fines because it was easier. That's how HOAs like this survive, through intimidation, bureaucracy, and fear. I wasn't going to let that happen to me, so I started documenting everything. Every letter, every fine, every email. I even installed a camera facing my front yard, just in case they tried to claim something else was out of compliance. A few weeks later, I got another certified letter, this one marked final notice. It said that due to repeated violations and unpaid fines, the HOA was initiating lien proceedings against my property. In simple terms, they were trying to take my home. That's when something inside me shifted. Up until that point, I'd tried to play by the rules. I'd appealed politely, followed procedure, stayed calm. But this was war. I took a day off work and drove to the county clerk's office. I pulled public records on the HOA corporation, its board members, their addresses, their annual filings. What I found made my blood boil. The HOA had been funneling community funds into a maintenance contract that didn't exist. Payments were going to a shell company registered under the name of Margaret's husband. Tens of thousands of dollars a year, gone. It was theft, plain and simple, but I didn't rush to expose it right away. I knew that if I played this wrong, they'd find a way to bury it. So I planned, quietly, methodically. Over the next month, I collected more proof, bank statements, copies of invoices, and testimonies from neighbors who'd suspected something shady but had never seen the evidence. And then, one morning, I received an envelope that nearly made me laugh out loud. The HOA had escalated their lien filing. They were moving to foreclose. They thought they had me cornered. What they didn't know was that I'd already contacted a lawyer, one who specialized in HOA corruption cases, and I was about to file my own lawsuit. But my plan wasn't just to stop them from taking my home. It was to take theirs instead. I wanted every single one of them held accountable. Margaret, her husband, the entire board. I wanted to dismantle their little empire from the inside out, so I waited. I waited for their arrogance to peak, for them to make the mistake I knew was coming. That mistake came at the next HOA election, the one where they planned to re-elect themselves without any competition. But this time, I was ready, because by then, half the neighborhood had started coming to me for advice. They were tired of the bullying, the fake fines, the fear. And I'd made sure every one of them had the documents proving what the board had been hiding. The day of the election, I didn't show up to the clubhouse alone. I walked in with 20 homeowners behind me, all holding copies of the evidence I'd gathered. The board wasn't expecting a crowd. They weren't expecting resistance, and they definitely weren't expecting what came next. That day is burned into my memory like a brand. The sky was heavy with summer heat, the kind that makes the air feel thick and electric. I parked a block away from the clubhouse and sat in my car for a few minutes before walking in. My hands were steady, but my heart was pounding hard enough to feel it in my throat. For months, I'd been living under their thumb, letters, fines, threats, and the looming risk of losing my home. But not anymore. Today wasn't about fear. Today was about truth. I'd spent weeks preparing for this meeting. Every piece of paper in my folder was labeled, cross-referenced, and verified. I had copies of cancelled checks, financial reports, shell company records, and HOA bylaws. Every one of them told the same story. The board had been stealing from us for years, hiding behind the authority we'd unknowingly handed them. By the time I walked into that clubhouse, the other homeowners were already gathered. I could feel the tension in the air, the usual nervous silence replaced by quiet murmurs. People had heard rumors of what I'd found, and they were here to see if it was true. At the front table, the HOA board sat as they always did. Margaret was in her usual seat at the center, wearing a pearl necklace and that same smug half-smile she always wore at these meetings. The other board members flanked her like bodyguards, flipping through their papers, pretending not to notice the crowd. They started the meeting as if nothing was wrong. Routine agenda items, vote approvals, maintenance updates. Business as usual. Then Margaret asked if there were any community concerns. That was my cue. I stood up and walked to the front of the room, holding my folder under my arm. I didn't need to raise my voice. The silence that fell over the room was enough. Every eye followed me. I started by thanking the board for their dedication to the community, which drew a few confused looks. Then I calmly said that I had been reviewing the HOA's public financial records, as was my right under state law, and I had found some inconsistencies. I placed the first document on the table in front of Margaret, a printed copy of a check written from the HOA account to a company called Evergreen Maintenance LLC. The check was for $18,000. Then I placed another one beside it, and another, each for different amounts, all to the same company. Then I placed a printout of the company's registration record from the Secretary of State's website. The registered agent? Charles Whitman, Margaret's husband. Why the room went completely silent. I didn't have to dramatize anything. The facts spoke louder than I ever could. I explained that evergreen maintenance didn't exist beyond a P.O. box, that no contractor had ever shown up under that name, and that the HOA's supposed landscaping expenses were being siphoned directly into a private account. I also showed how the board had been approving these payments during closed-door sessions without recorded minutes, something explicitly forbidden under HOA law. The other homeowners were shocked. Some angry, some whispering, others filming on their phones. Margaret tried to maintain her composure, insisting there must be a misunderstanding. But the evidence was undeniable. The meeting quickly spiraled out of her control. One by one, homeowners started demanding explanations, waving their copies of the documents I'd shared with them earlier that week. People who had once been silent out of fear now spoke up with confidence. That night, for the first time, the board realized they weren't untouchable. By the end of the meeting, the board had motioned to adjourn early, citing disruptive behavior. They left the room without answering a single question. But it didn't matter. The truth was already out. The next morning, I filed a formal complaint with the county and sent a full dossier of the evidence to the state's Department of Consumer Protection. Then, I contacted a local news outlet that covered HOA scandals. I didn't give them my name yet. I just told them to look into the financials of my neighborhood's board. Within a week, a reporter called me directly. She'd confirmed my findings and wanted an interview. When the story went live, it exploded. The headline read, "Local HOA accused of embezzling thousands. Homeowners demand answers." The photo under the headline showed the front of our clubhouse, the same place where they'd tried to shame me for my mulch color just months before. The article detailed everything: names, amounts, missing records, and the ongoing investigation. Overnight, the narrative flipped. The same neighbors who used to side-eye me now came to my door to thank me. They were angry, but they were also empowered. Then, things escalated even more. Margaret and her husband lawyered up immediately. The board tried to spin the story, claiming it was a clerical misunderstanding, but nobody was buying it. The HOA's bank froze their operating account pending investigation, and the board was forced to call an emergency election to fill temporary vacancies. That election was my chance. I didn't plan to run it first. My original goal had been to stop them, to protect my home, to make sure no one else got bullied like I had. But as the days went on and I watched the community scramble to rebuild, I realized something important. If good people didn't step up, bad ones would keep filling the void. So, I ran for HOA president. It wasn't about power, it was about cleaning house. The campaign wasn't glamorous. There were no signs or speeches, just word of mouth and facts. People knew what I'd done, what I'd uncovered, and how much time I'd put into it. They trusted me because I'd never asked for anything in return. Election day came, and for the first time, the clubhouse was packed. Every homeowner who'd ever been fined unfairly, every person who'd been ignored or disrespected by the board, they all showed up. When the votes were counted, I won by a landslide. It was surreal. 1 year ago, they were trying to take my home. Now, I was sitting in the same chair Margaret used to occupy, staring at the HOA seal on the wall, knowing the power dynamics had flipped completely, but I wasn't there to gloat. I was there to rebuild. My first order of business was to hire an independent auditor to go through every financial record the HOA had touched for the last 5 years. The results were even worse than I expected. Thousands of dollars in consulting fees had gone to people related to board members. Maintenance contracts had been inflated, duplicate payments sent, and in one case, funds had been used to buy gift cards for board appreciation. The total amount missing? Over $120,000. The evidence was turned over to the county prosecutor, and within 2 months, criminal charges were filed. Margaret and her husband were both charged with fraud and embezzlement. 2 other board members were named as co-conspirators. Justice was finally catching up. But here's the thing about revenge. When it starts, it doesn't stop neatly. Even though they were facing charges, the damage they'd done to the community was deep. People were distrustful, bitter, and wary of anyone in charge. I couldn't blame them, so I made transparency the core of everything we did. We posted every transaction online, opened every meeting to homeowners, and rewrote the bylaws so that no board member could approve a contract without at least 3 homeowner signatures. The trust didn't rebuild overnight, but slowly, it did. I also learned something about myself in the process. When I first bought my house, I thought owning property was about pride and stability. But now I realized it was about accountability. Home ownership isn't just about lawns and fences. It's about standing up for the community you live in, even when it's uncomfortable. As for Margaret and her husband, they eventually settled their case out of court. They were fined, barred from serving on any HOA board in the state, and forced to repay a portion of the stolen funds, but that wasn't the end of it. After the settlement, the property they owned, ironically, just a few streets away from mine, went up for sale. The proceeds were supposed to go toward restitution, but the market had cooled, and the house sat empty for months. Then one morning, as I reviewed the foreclosure listings in the county database, I noticed something strange. Their property had been repossessed by the bank. For a moment, I just stared at the screen. The same people who had tried to take my home had now lost theirs. It wasn't something I celebrated. It was something I reflected on. Sometimes, karma doesn't need help, it just needs time. But I wasn't done yet, because while the criminal side had wrapped up, I'd uncovered one last piece of the puzzle. Something that pointed to even deeper corruption involving a regional property management firm tied to multiple HOAs in our county. And the same shell companies that had appeared in our books showed up in theirs. That's when I realized this wasn't just a neighborhood issue, it was systemic. And if I'd learned anything, it was that when someone abuses power, it's never just once. I made a few calls, reached out to homeowners in those other neighborhoods, and before long, a small coalition began to form. We compared notes, shared documents, and built a timeline that stretched back years. The deeper we dug, the more we realized this was bigger than any one HOA. This wasn't just about my revenge anymore. It was about reform. But reform doesn't come easy. There were still people trying to protect their own interests, still management companies trying to silence whistleblowers. I received anonymous letters telling me to move on, and one morning I found a nail in my car tire. Coincidence? Maybe, but I doubted it. Still, I kept going because by now, I'd already lost too much sleep, too much time, and too much peace to walk away. I wasn't fighting for revenge anymore. I was fighting for accountability. By the end of that year, my HOA wasn't just functional, it was thriving. We'd reduced dues by 15%, cleaned up the community finances, and turned our annual report into a public document anyone could access online. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now waved from their driveways. I thought that was the end of the story, that I could finally rest. But I was wrong, because one afternoon, I received a phone call from the county clerk's office. They'd found something new in the old HOA filings, something that didn't make sense. A second corporate account tied to the HOA, registered years before any of us moved in. An account still active, still receiving deposits. And guess whose name was on it? Margaret's. The woman who'd already been charged, already forced out, still had one last thread of control left hanging in the system. That discovery was going to pull me into one more battle, one that would make everything before it looked like a warm-up. When the county clerk called, I remember staring at my phone long after the conversation ended. The words echoed in my head. There's another account. After everything that had happened, months of investigations, public exposure, new elections, I couldn't believe there was still something left hiding in the shadows. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, papers spread out across every inch of wood. The account in question had been registered almost a decade ago, right after the HOA was formed. It used the same association name, same address, but none of the current board members, even the legitimate ones, had ever heard of it. It was still active, and it was still moving money. The transactions weren't large, small deposits, a few withdrawals, nothing flashy, just enough to stay under the radar. But the account had been used to transfer funds to multiple entities across the state, each linked, in one way or another, to Margaret's husband's old business network. It was like finding the loose thread in a sweater and realizing the whole thing could unravel. The first thing I did was notify our attorney. He agreed to file a motion demanding full disclosure of all HOA-related accounts under the association's tax ID. But as the paperwork moved forward, I started connecting more dots on my own. Through public filings, I found that the hidden account wasn't just siphoning from us, it was part of a larger web of small, connected HOAs. Each of them had minor discrepancies in their books, none big enough to trigger alarms individually. But together, it was a pattern of small theft, repeated across neighborhoods, adding up to something massive. It wasn't just about my HOA anymore. This was about an entire system of abuse hiding behind community management firms and outdated oversight. I reached out to the journalist who'd covered the original story, sent her everything I'd found, and asked if she'd look deeper. She was intrigued. Within a week, she had tracked down 3 other communities that had quietly filed lawsuits against the same property management company, the same one Margaret had used to manage our funds before we took back control. All of them had similar stories: unexplained fines, mysterious maintenance contracts, missing funds, and boards stacked with friends of the same people. It was organized corruption, disguised as neighborhood order, and I was about to blow it open, but before the news story broke, something strange happened. One morning, as I walked out to grab my mail, I noticed an envelope stuck between my storm door and the frame. It wasn't postmarked. Someone had left it there by hand. Inside was a single sheet of paper with one sentence typed in bold, black letters: "You've made your point. Stop digging." There was no signature, no address, nothing else. For a moment, I felt that old tension return, the same fear I'd felt months ago when I thought they could take my home. But fear has a different shape once you've faced it head on. It doesn't paralyze you anymore. It fuels you, so I didn't stop digging. Instead, I went public. The journalist's new expose dropped 2 weeks later, complete with evidence from 4 different HOAs, financial records, and testimony from former board members who turned whistleblower. The headline read, "The HOA Web: How One Management Firm Drained Millions from Homeowners Across the State." The story blew up. Local news covered it first, then regional outlets picked it up, and within days, it reached national platforms. People everywhere were suddenly questioning what was really happening behind the gates of their planned communities. The State Attorney General announced a formal investigation into the management firm and its affiliated HOAs. And the very next day, I received a subpoena requesting all documentation from our neighborhood, the same paperwork I'd already compiled months earlier. For once, the system was working in favor of the homeowners. Margaret's name resurfaced in the investigation. Even though she'd already settled her previous case, it turned out she had still been profiting from the scheme through residual contracts. Her husband's business was listed among the firms under scrutiny. The irony was sharp. They'd tried to take my home through lies and intimidation, and now the truth was taking theirs through due process and evidence. When their second property officially went into foreclosure, I felt a strange calm, not satisfaction, exactly, but closure. Because the truth was, I hadn't set out to ruin anyone's life. I'd set out to save my own, but once you start pulling on the threads of corruption, you can't control where they lead, or who gets caught in the unraveling. Over the following months, the investigation widened. State regulators suspended several management licenses, and multiple board members from other neighborhoods resigned under pressure. The firm's executives faced indictments for fraud and racketeering. And me. I was called in to testify. Standing in that courtroom, I wasn't nervous. I'd lived this story from start to finish. I told them everything, from the first letter about my mulch to the night I uncovered the shell company. The judge listened, the lawyers took notes, and I could tell they understood something deeper than just financial crime. They understood how easily power can be abused when nobody's watching. After my testimony, I walked out of the courthouse into bright afternoon light. I remember breathing in the air and realizing how long I'd been holding my breath. Months, maybe years. It was finally over, but life after a battle like that doesn't just go back to normal. It settles into something quieter, wiser. The neighborhood changed. Not just physically, but in spirit. The fences were still the same height, the lawns still neatly trimmed, but there was a new kind of peace in the air, the kind that comes from people knowing they have a voice again. We started a community event every spring, an open barbecue where everyone could come, no dues, no rules, just neighbors being neighbors. The HOA meetings were different now too. No podiums, no power plays, just folding chairs in a circle, people talking like equals. Transparency became our default, and through it all, I learned that revenge isn't always about getting even. Sometimes, it's about taking back control, about reclaiming what was yours from the start. In the end, I didn't just save my home. I changed how the entire neighborhood operated, but the story doesn't stop there. A few months after the investigation wrapped up, I got another call from a lawyer representing a class action group of homeowners across the state. They wanted to use my case as part of their foundation for a broader reform lawsuit, one that could push for new legislation governing HOA transparency and accountability. They asked if I'd be willing to let them cite my documents and testimony. I agreed without hesitation. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about legacy. By the time the reform bill reached the state legislature, I'd become something of an accidental advocate. Local news outlets interviewed me about HOA reform. Homeowners from across the country reached out online to share their own horror stories, and suddenly I realized this wasn't just my fight. It was everyone's. The bill eventually passed, mandating stricter financial reporting for all homeowners associations in the state. Every HOA now had to publicly disclose its financial records, undergo annual audits, and hold open elections with third-party oversight. It wasn't flashy. It didn't make national headlines. But for the people living under the quiet tyranny of bad HOAs, it changed everything, and sometimes, quiet change is the loudest kind. One afternoon, months later, I drove past Margaret's old property. The house had been renovated and resold. The new owners were young, just starting out, the same way I'd been when I first moved into the neighborhood. They were planting flowers along the walkway, laughing, not knowing the history buried beneath those walls. I smiled. Not out of spite, but out of closure, because in a way, that house symbolized the full circle of it all. They'd tried to take my home, but through patience, truth, and persistence, I had taken theirs, not by force or vengeance, but by justice. It wasn't about property anymore. It was about principle. I went home, sat on my porch, and looked out across the street. The neighborhood was quiet again. No more angry letters, no more fear. Just people living their lives in peace. For a long time, I thought revenge was about making others feel what you felt. But now I understand. It's about making sure no one else ever has to. That's the real victory. That's what it means to take your home back. The state investigation led to over a dozen arrests and millions in restitution. The HOA management firm was dissolved, and new laws ensured transparency across the board. As for me, I still live in the same house. The brown mulch is still in my front yard, just the way I like it. Every time I see it, I'm reminded that sometimes standing up for yourself isn't just about winning a fight, it's about ending one, so nobody else has to start theirs.